watch. Our next guest says that Steve Jobs' cloud initiative means Apple fans will increasingly own more than one Apple device. For more, we bring in our friend, InsideTrack regular Eugene Munster of Piper Jaffray. He is one of Wall Street's top Apple analysts. He's been covering tech and media companies for more than 15 years. He is joining us now from Minneapolis. Gene reiterated his overweight on Apple. $554 is his price target. Gene, always glad to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. Apple has this hardware, this breadth of products. Is the iCloud just more glue?
It really is. It's more glue. It's more fuel for this halo effect. The reality is consumers are going from owning one device, a laptop, to multiple mobile devices, including a smartphone and a tablet. And to manage all of these, you need some sort of a glue, some sort of a system to make managing the media and content easier. And so that's really what iCloud does. And as you talked about earlier, is that this does it better than anyone else. And so that's going to make it easier for people to buy multiple Apple devices.
Gene, were you surprised that iCloud is being offered for free?
We were thinking that it would be somewhere between $25 and $99 a year, so that was a big surprise. There is a little bit of a catch, though. If you want your music library that was purchased off of iTunes or potentially downloaded illegally to be shared through this network, you have to pay $25 a year. And so it's not quite free, but it's pretty close to free and was clearly less expensive than we were anticipating.
Is it possible to quantify at all, Gene, how much of a premium Apple can keep charging for its products based that we've been drawn into the ecosystem?
Well, one thing we know is this, is that if you look at the iPhone over the past several quarters, the ASP has been going up, which really is defying the laws of pricing physics. Is that most users or most investors believe that over time pricing goes down. And so what we've seen is they've kind of built this ecosystem is that the pricing has been inching up. The probability that their pricing continues to go up is low just because it's so competitive. But I think it's things like iCloud are going to maintain these prices longer than most investors think. So to answer your question, this is good for ASPs. It is good for the premium that people pay for Apple products. Because in the grand scheme of things, to pay a little bit extra for a phone for a consumer and to get these options is well worth it.
Gene, glad to continue the conversation. We just rolled a clip of Steve Jobs yesterday. How important was it that he was there for this day?
It's always great to see Steve Jobs. I mean, he's somewhere across between Henry Ford and Willy Wonka, and he really defines Apple, and so it's always good to see him. I think investors are kind of at a different place today about Steve Jobs after January. I think we're just happy to see him, and I think people's expectations are it's kind of a quarter-to-quarter thing as far as his participation in these.
Gene, it's Erik here. Speaking of expectations, was there something disappointing about this presentation yesterday? Because Apple shares ended the day down 1.6%. I know the stock is a bit volatile, but it does seem as though people went into this hoping perhaps for a little bit more. Were you disappointed?
Well, we weren't disappointed because they had this press release out before, which basically laid out what they're going to talk about, which was rare that Apple does something like that. And at the end of the day, since Apple always surprises people, even though they had a press release out, there was still some anticipation that they were going to announce this iPhone 5 hardware. They did talk about timing of the new mobile operating system, which implies a September iPhone 5 launch. So it kind of infers the timing of that, but they didn't explicitly say that. So based on my conversation with investors yesterday afternoon, that's the piece that they really wanted to hear. Given they didn't hear that, stock traded off.
So, Gene, is hardware like the new iPhone 5, whenever it appears sometime presumably in the fall, still going to be the thing that distinguishes Apple as a company and a stock from everybody else, as opposed to what we saw yesterday, which was largely software and services based? Deirdre was talking earlier about how this stuff is the glue that makes Apple unique. Why is it that people don't seem to place more emphasis on that stuff? They care just about the iPhone, the iPad, maybe the Mac, and the iPod Touch.
I think that the hardware side gets more attention just because it's more definitive. You see the new hardware that comes out. But the reality is that the software and these cloud services are really what defines it. It's really a combination of both. dating back to when the iPod came out, that was unique. There were about 24 competitors to the iPod, but what was unique was its cooperation with iTunes. We're seeing the same thing with the iPhone and these cloud services and the software, and so the simple take is that it's really a combination of both. You need both good hardware and good software.
Gene, getting back to Steve Jobs, do you see any irony that he is essentially sidelining the PC, which is certainly an area that he helped to pioneer?
It's definitely ironic. Yeah, he's the one who really started the movement. But that's what's great about him is he just kind of moves the conversation to where it should be. And that's another important point that came out of yesterday's event. Beyond the iCloud, they talked about not needing a computer to set up an iPhone or an iPad. And this is important. So for emerging markets to be able to use these devices as their primary computing device just got a lot easier. So I think you're going to see improved growth in some of these emerging markets based on some of the announcements yesterday.
Just to clarify, Gene, the reason is maybe that they don't have all the infrastructure that some more developed countries do have.
Exactly. A lot of these people don't have a computer to set up, have iTunes on it to set up your iPad or your iPhone. Now they don't need that, so they can actually use these as their primary computing devices.
Gene, is it fair, though, to use the cloud, whether it's Apple's cloud or somebody else's cloud, as the death knell for PCs, whether they be HP's PCs or Dell's PCs or whomever's PCs? That sort of seems to be the sense that some people are bringing to the announcements we heard from Apple yesterday. It's the end of the PC. You don't need one anymore.
Well, I think what's really being said here is that mobile computing is changing, and the PC as a standalone desktop really isn't as relevant. Obviously, mobile computers, laptops are still relevant, but the reason why these mobile devices can become more impactful in our everyday lives is because of cloud computing, because of things like iCloud. So I think it is an important part. The reason why mobile becomes legitimate is because of web services, and so it is having an impact on the overall PC demand.
Let's go back to our conversation with Eugene Munster of Piper Jaffray. We're talking about Steve Jobs, Apple's new iCloud, and a bunch of other things the Apple CEO had to announce yesterday. Gene, you were just telling us that this may not be quite the death knell for the PC, but bit by bit, companies like Apple are making the PC less relevant. Here's what I'd like to know. Is Steve Jobs making a mistake by confining these services, particularly the power of iCloud, to Apple devices only?
Yeah, I think that as far as Apple devices only, that's in their best interest to try to connect those devices, and that's why they can do it so well, is they control the whole ecosystem. Google can't do that with Android, Microsoft can't do that. So that's one of the benefits of such a great experience, is by them controlling it. I think a fair criticism is the fact that the content on these is really exclusively Apple content that gets synced up. So for example, if you want to sync documents, they got to be created in Apple's iWorks. That's a little irritating, I think, for some people, not being able to sync up maybe some Microsoft documents on these devices. But I think the simple takeaway is that to get this to work as well as it does, it's got to be controlled by one company, and that's what Apple does well.
Gene, always great to have you here on the Inside Track. Eugene Munster of Piper Jaffray.